They say that history is written by the victors, but there are some chapters so profoundly tragic, so steeped in shadow, that they are written not in ink, but in the cold silence of the grave, where the only truth is the one that whispers from the dark corners of a forgotten ruin. Welcome back to the Unveiled Scroll, where today we pull back the heavy velvet curtain of time to reveal a story that has been buried for nearly 4 centuries, a narrative of obsession, madness, and a love so consuming it devoured an entire civilization, leaving behind nothing but dust and echoes. If you are brave enough to walk this path with us, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this dark tale with those who dare to question the official records. Because what I am about to tell you is not found in your textbooks, but in the frantic scribblings of a madman found sealed within a lead box, beneath the foundations of what we now call the Blackwood Monastery. Our story takes us back to the year 1642 to a remote province, nestled high in the Carpathian Mountains. A place known then as Vesperia, a thriving hub of commerce and art ruled by a man whose intellect was rivaled only by his sorrow. Lord Alistair Thorne. Alistair was not a tyrant in the traditional sense. He was a scholar, an architect, a man of science who looked at the chaotic world around him and sought to impose order upon it. Yet his heart was not made of stone. It belonged entirely to his wife, the Lady Alara, whose beauty was said to be so radiant that it made the stained glass of the cathedral look dull by comparison. But fate, as it often does in these dark chronicles, played a cruel hand, for Alara fell ill with a wasting sickness that no doctor could cure, and no priest could pray away, watching the life drain from her eyes day by day. Alistair's brilliant mind began to fracture. He became convinced that death was not an inevitability, but a flaw in the grand design, a mistake that could be corrected if only one had the will and the architectural genius to build a sanctuary, where time itself dared not enter. He shut himself away in his study, ignoring the pleas of his council and the cries of his people who were suffering from a harsh winter and a failing harvest. He pored over forbidden texts, ancient blueprints of necromantic geometry, and journals of architects who had gone mad trying to build the Tower of Babel. It was during these feverish nights that Alistair conceived of his magnum opus, the Silent Citadel, a massive structure designed not just to house his dying wife, but to act as a metaphysical machine, a labyrinth of stone and mirrors arranged with such precise mathematical cruelty that it would trap the very essence of the soul, preventing it from departing to the afterlife. He believed that if he could construct a perfect sealed environment, a place of absolute stillness, he could pause the ticking clock of mortality for Alara. But to build such a monstrosity, he needed more than stone and mortars. He needed labor, and he needed silence. Absolute silence. He issued a decree that shocked the province of Vesperia, forbidding all loud noises within the city limits. Church bells were melted down, blacksmiths were forced to work with padded hammers, and even the children were forbidden to laugh or cry in the streets, under penalty of imprisonment in the dungeons beneath the city. The people of Vesperia, terrified of their lord's descending madness, obeyed at first, believing it to be a temporary grief. But as the weeks turned into months, the restrictions tightened. Alistair began to requisition materials from the homes of the common folk, tearing down their chimneys and walls to harvest the specific dark granite he needed for the citadel, claiming that the stone held a resonance necessary for the preservation of life. The city began to look like a skeleton stripped of its flesh to feed the growing tumor at its center, which was the citadel rising ominously against the gray sky, its spires twisted like grasping fingers reaching for a heaven that had long since turned its back on Vesperia. Inside the palace, Lady Alara grew weaker, her skin translucent, her breath a shallow rattle. Yet Alistair refused to let her go. He moved her into the unfinished heart of the citadel, a chamber lined with polished obsidian mirrors intended to reflect her life force back into her body endlessly. He spent his days and nights at her bedside, whispering promises of eternity, his eyes burning with a manic light that terrified the few servants allowed to enter the inner sanctum. It was on the eve of the winter solstice that the true horror began. For Alistair realized that the geometry of the building was flawed. It lacked a binding agent, a source of energy powerful enough to seal the metaphysical cracks through which death might slip in. He looked out from the high tower at the silent, shivering city below, and realized that the silence he had enforced was not enough. He needed a silence that was permanent, a silence that was heavy with sacrifice. He summoned his captain of the guard, a man named Kalen, who had served the Thorne family for 3 generations, and gave him an order so vile that Kalen reportedly vomited upon hearing it. Alistair demanded that the tongues of every citizen in the lower district be removed, not as a punishment, but as a necessary component of the ritual, claiming that the chaotic noise of human speech was disrupting the delicate harmonic balance of the citadel. Kaelin refused drawing his sword on his liege, but Alistair was prepared. He had not just been studying architecture, he had been dabbling in the dark alchemy of control, and with a wave of his hand he unleashed a powdery substance into the air, a toxin derived from the nightshade of the deep caves, which paralyzed Kaelin instantly, leaving him conscious but unable to move, a prisoner in his own body. Alistair then took the sword himself, and what happened next in that throne room is a matter of debate among historians. But the legend says that Alistair did not kill Kaelin. Instead, he used him as the first living brick in the wall of the inner sanctum, sealing him alive within a hollow pillar, ensuring that Kaelin's silent scream would resonate through the structure forever. With his loyal captain gone, and his mind completely Alistair turned his attention to the city, using his alchemical knowledge to poison the water supply, not to kill the population immediately, but to render them pliable, to dull their senses and sap their will to resist. So that, when his hooded constructs mechanical automatons he had built in secret marched into the streets to carry out his dark work, there was no rebellion, only a sluggish, confused acceptance. The construction of the silent citadel accelerated, fueled by the terrified labor of a populace that was slowly losing its mind and its voice. Literally and metaphorically, as the winter snows buried Vesperian white, the city became a ghost town inhabited by the living, a place where the only sound was the grinding of stone against stone, and the heavy breathing of the dying Lady Alara in the heart of the fortress. But the universe demands balance, and such a violation of natural law could not go unanswered. For in the shadows of the twisted alleyways, a resistance was forming, led not by a warrior or a scholar, but by a blind musician named Elias, who, though he could not see the horror rising in the center of his city, could hear the wrongness of it the way the wind howled through the unnatural angles of the citadel, sounding like the wailing of damned souls. Elias knew that Alistair's design relied on sound waves or the lack thereof, and he realized that the only way to shatter the citadel power was not with swords or fire, but with a frequency, a sound so pure and powerful that it would crack the obsidian mirrors and break the seal holding death at bay. Elias moved through the sewers beneath Vesperia, not with eyes, but with a heightened sense of touch and hearing, feeling the vibrations of the city's suffering in the damp stone walls. He gathered a small band of rebel survivors who had escaped the initial purges, hidden in the labyrinthine catacombs that predated the Thorn dynasty, where the air was thick with the smell of mold and old secrets. Among them was a disgraced clockmaker named Silas, who understood the mechanics of Alistair's automatons, and a former choir mistress named Mara, who remembered the old songs that had been banned by the Lord's decree. Together they devised a plan that was as desperate as it was brilliant, using the scraps of metal and hollow piping scavenged from the Undercity to construct a massive, resonating chamber, a crude but powerful instrument designed to mimic the frequency of a breaking glacial sheet, a sound sharp enough to pierce the magical silence shielding the citadel. Above ground, the situation had deteriorated into a nightmare of absolute stillness. The snow continued to fall, burying the cobblestones in a thick white blanket that muffled even the footsteps of the clockwork soldiers patrolling the streets, their brass faces impassive as they dragged anyone caught making a sound off to the dungeons to have their vocal cords severed. Lord Alistair, meanwhile, had lost all touch with reality. He spent his hours pacing the Hall of Mirrors, his reflection fractured into 1,000 shards, each one showing a different version of his torment. He spoke to Alara as if she were awake, ignoring the fact that her skin had turned the color of gray slate, and her heartbeat was so slow it could barely be felt. He was convinced that the silence was work, in that he had successfully paused time, but he failed to notice the rot setting in at the edges of the room, the way the velvet curtains were molding and the silver goblets were tarnishing at an accelerated rate. For, in his attempt to stop death, he had also stopped life, creating a stagnant pocket of existence where nothing could flourish. The date of the final ritual approached, the winter solstice, when the moon would be at its perigee and the gravitational pull would be strongest. Alistair believed this was the moment to lock the citadel's geometry forever, turning the temporary silence into an eternal stasis. He prepared the final sacrifice, which was not a person but the memory of the city itself. He ordered his automatons to burn the archives, the libraries, and the art galleries, erasing the history of Vesperia, so that the only reality that existed was the one inside the citadel. Down in the catacombs, Elias and his rebels felt the heat of the fires burning above, and knew their time was running out. They pulled their makeshift instrument, a grotesque organ of rusted pipes and leather bellows, toward the ventilation shaft that led directly beneath the citadel's main plaza. It was a grueling journey through narrow tunnels slick with slime and infested with rats that had grown large and aggressive in the unnatural darkness, but they pushed on, driven by the knowledge that if they failed, Vesperia would not just die, it would be erased from existence entirely. As they positioned the device beneath the heavy iron grate, Silas, the clockmaker, worked frantically to align the gears while Mara hummed the counter-melody. Under her breath, a soft, mournful tune that served as the tuning fork for their weapon of sound, Elias stood ready, his hands hovering over the keys of the instrument, his blind eyes turned upward. Toward the crushing weight of the stone ceiling, he could feel the pulse of the citadel above him, a heavy, rhythmic thrumming that felt like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, and he knew that Alistair was beginning the incantation. Up in the tower, Alistair raised his hands, the obsidian mirrors glowing with a sickly violet light, as he began to chant the words written in the forbidden tome, words that twisted the air and caused the shadows to detach themselves from the walls and dance on their own. Alara's body began to levitate off the bed, her hair floating in a knot, winter eyes snapping open to reveal pools of absolute blackness. She was no longer the woman he loved. She was a vessel, a conduit for the void he was inviting into the world. The silence in the city reached a crescendo, a pressure so intense that it caused nosebleeds among the cowering citizens in their homes. The very air seemed to solidify, turning into a gel that made movement difficult. It was the silence of the deep ocean, the silence of the grave, and Alistair smiled, tears streaming down his face, believing he had finally triumphed over God himself. But at that precise moment of supreme hubris deep beneath the earth, Elias struck the first chord of the resonance engine. The sound was not loud in the traditional sense. It was a vibration, a tearing screech that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the bones of everyone in Vesperia. It shot up through the ventilation shaft, amplifying as it hit the unique acoustic geometry of the Citadel's plaza, turning the fortress's own design against it. The ground shook violently as if the earth itself was rejecting the parasite built upon its back, and inside the hollow mirrors the glass began to sing a high-pitched wail that matched the frequency from below. Alistair's chant faltered, his concentration broken by the intrusion of this chaotic noise. He looked around wildly, seeing hairline cracks appearing on the surface of the obsidian mirrors, the violet light flickering and pulsing erratically. He screamed a command for silence, but his voice was swallowed by the rising cacophony coming from the floorboards. The automatons in the streets jerked to a halt, their internal mechanisms jammed by the sonic vibrations, causing them to collapse into piles of twitching metal. The citizens, realizing the spell was breaking, began to pour out of their houses, finding their voices, again joining their screams and shouts to the sound of the machine below, creating a wave of chaotic human noise that battered against the walls of the citadel like a physical battering ram. Inside the sanctum, the levitating body of Alara began to convulse the void energy within her, reacting violently to the disruption she opened her mouth and let out a sound that was not human, a multi-layered scream that sounded like 1,000 voices crying out in unison, shattering the windows of the tower and sending shards of glass raining down on the city below like deadly confetti. Alistair tried to rush to her to hold her down to stabilize the ritual, but the air pressure in the room had changed, creating a vortex that threw him back against the wall. He watched in horror as the perfection he had strived for crumbled before his eyes, the mirrors exploding, one by one, releasing the trapped reflections, which did not dissipate but formed into ghostly, translucent figures that swirled around the room, the spirits of those who had died in the silence coming back to claim their due. The room was no longer a sanctuary of silence, but a vortex of screaming light where the laws of physics seemed to dissolve into a terrifying fluidity. Alistair scrambled across the floor, which was tilting dangerously as the foundations of the citadel groaned under the sonic assault. He reached out for the spirit of Kalen, his loyal captain whose translucent form was stepping out of the shattered pillar, but the ghost did not offer a hand of forgiveness. Instead, it looked down at its former master with eyes that were hollow pits of sadness and pointed a spectral finger toward the bed where Alara was writhing. It was then that Alistair heard it, the sound that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who survived that night, for Alara spoke, but it was not the voice of his beloved wife. It was a chorus of every victim who had died building this monument to madness. A legion speaking through one throat, begging not for life, but for release. She cried out that she was cold, that the silence he had imposed upon her was not a preservation but a prison of sensory deprivation where her soul had been left to wander in a boundless dark void, unable to find the light of the afterlife, because he had blocked the path with his arrogance. The realization hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow, shattering his delusion more completely than the resonance engine had shattered The mirrors he saw now that his love had mutated into a parasitic obsession that he had not been saving her but torturing her for months, keeping her tethered to a rotting body in a city of muted slaves. Below in the catacombs, the resonance engine finally succumbed to the immense pressure. It was generating the rusted pipes red hot and vibrating so violently that they began to disintegrate. Shrapnel flew through the damp air, striking down the brave rebels one by one. Elias, the blind musician, stood his ground to the very last second, his hands bleeding on the keys, his face serene amidst the carnage, knowing that his song had reached the heavens before the boiler exploded in a massive concussion of steam and fire that collapsed the tunnel, burying him and his companions instantly in a tomb of their own making. But their sacrifice was not in vain, for the explosion severed the main structural support of the citadel, causing the central spire to list heavily to the west, cracking the great stone seal that Alistair had placed over the city's heart. Back in the high tower, the floor split open, revealing the churning machinery of the building's core. A grinding maw of gears and pistons that were now chewing on stone and debris. Alistair knew there was no escape. He knew that Vesperia was doomed, but in those final moments clarity returned to him. He crawled to the bed and took Alira's cold hand in his, whispering a frantic apology not to the gods, but to her. He realized there was only one way to free her soul from the trap he had built. He had to destroy the vessel, he had to destroy himself, and the focal point of the ritual. With a strength born of total despair, Alistair dragged himself and Alara toward the broken window where the winter wind was. Howling like a banshee, he looked out one last time at his city, which was now burning not with fire, but with the chaotic energy of the Unleashed. Spelled purple lightning arcing from the rooftops, turning the snow into steam. He did not ask for redemption, for he knew he deserved none. He simply held Alara close, shielding her face from the destruction, and stepped out into the void, plunging from the highest spire of the silent citadel, just as the main dome collapsed inward, imploding. With a sound that was paradoxically silent, a sudden vacuum that sucked all noise, all light, and all matter into a singularity for a brief impossible second before exploding outward with the force of a small star. The shock wave flattened the upper districts of Vesperia, instantly turning stone to dust and wood to ash. But strangely, the destruction stopped at the edge of the lower city, where the common folk lived, contained by an invisible barrier, or perhaps by the lingering resonance of Elias's final chord. When the dust settled, days later, the survivors crawled out from their cellars to find a landscape that defied explanation. The silent citadel was gone, vanished completely, leaving behind a massive crater that was perfectly smooth, as if scooped out by a giant spoon, and in the center of that crater, suspended in midair, was a sphere of swirling gray mist, distinct from the surrounding air, hovering silently above the ruin. The people of Vesperia found that while they could speak again, while the birds sang and the wind blew, there was a zone of absolute silence extending for a mile. Around the crater, a place where no sound could exist, where if you shouted, your voice simply disappeared as soon as it left your lips. They say that if you walk to the edge of that silent zone on the anniversary of the winter solstice, and look into the swirling mist, you can see two figures locked in an embrace, falling forever in a loop of time, unable to land, unable to die, trapped in the very moment of their destruction. The city was eventually abandoned, the survivors moving down the mountain to tell their tale to anyone who would listen, warning travelers never to seek out the ruins of Vesperia. For though the architect is gone, his design remains imprinted on the fabric of the world, a scar that refuses to heal. But the story does not end therefore. In the centuries that followed, the legend of the weeping architect attracted a new kind of visitor, not pilgrims or historians, but occultists and scientists, men like Alistair who believed that within that sphere of silence lay the key to unlocking the mysteries of death, and one such expedition led by a Soviet parapsychologist in the late 1950s ventured into the crater, and what they found, or rather what they failed to find, is the subject of the final classified report that I hold in my hands. This report suggests that the sphere is not empty, but that it is a doorway, a tear in the reality that leads to a dimension, composed entirely of memory and regret, and that Alistair's machine actually worked too well. It didn't just stop time for Alara, it stopped time for the entire localized area, creating a pocket universe where the year 1642 repeats endlessly in a loop of silent suffering. The region surrounding the Vesperia crater became known simply as the Scar of the Earth, a gaping wound on the landscape that defied geological understanding. It was strictly avoided by all sane men, for the air of the Silent Zone was said to induce paralyzing fear and profound existential dread, a psychic residue of Alistair's final tormented moments. For centuries, the story persisted as a macabre local myth, a warning whispered around hearth fires until the mid-20th century, when the age of atomic physics and deep state paranoia brought new attention to old anomalies. Enter Dr. Fyodor Volkov, a Soviet parapsychologist operating under the highest level of secrecy. His mandate was to investigate fringe phenomena that might offer strategic advantages during the Cold War. Volkov's team, equipped with experimental sound dampening technology and instruments designed to measure distortions in the space-time continuum, arrived at the perimeter of the Silent Zone in 1957. Their findings, documented in what is now known as the Volkov Memorandum, are perhaps more disturbing than the tale of the architect itself. Volkov confirmed that the sphere of gray mist hovering above the crater was indeed an anomaly, a localized temporal and spatial distortion that consumed all kinetic energy, which is why sound could not exist within its boundaries. But his most terrifying discovery was revealed when his team managed to lower a specialized camera into the heart of the mist. What the camera captured was not empty space, but an infinite loop, a continuous playback of the moment Alistair and Alara fell from the tower, forever frozen in the second of their suicidal leap. Volkov theorized that Alistair's obsessive desire to freeze time for Alara, combined with the catastrophic energy release of the Citadel's collapse, did not destroy the city, but instead imprinted the final act of defiance upon reality, creating a pocket dimension, where the architect achieved a perverse form of his eternal preservation, but only of his ultimate failure and despair. The memorandum describes an environment composed of pure regret, where the figures are forever falling, their faces locked in expressions of tragic realization, a museum of a single moment of biographic sorrow. Volkov concluded that to enter the sphere would not result in death, but in an eternal psychic purgatory, joining Alistair and Alara in their infinite descent, a final ironic fate for the man who tried to cheat mortality, only to become a monument to its power. The Soviet project was immediately classified and abandoned. The crater, fenced off and labeled a natural radiation hazard, a convenient lie to explain the death of Volkov's team, who allegedly went insane attempting to penetrate the sphere, not from sound but from the overwhelming psychological pressure of infinite, silent despair. And so, the dark chapter of Vesperia concludes not with a battle or a triumphant escape, but with a whimper, a lingering silence that stretches across the centuries, a chilling reminder that the line between genius and madness is often just the width of a single brick, and that some attempts to master life only serve to empower death. Lord Alistair Thorne, the obsessed architect, did not erase the memory of his empire. He merely condensed it into one inescapable moment, a moment of tragedy that floats forever in the mountain air, waiting for the curious and the foolish to step too close to the silence. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the pseudo-history of the Silent Citadel. We hope that the terror and the beauty of this grim tale stay with you long after the video ends. If you enjoyed this dive into the deeper darkness of the past, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the Unveiled Scroll, and sharing this episode with those who appreciate the stories that lurk just beneath the surface of the official records. And be sure to check out our other videos where we explore similar dark and unwritten histories. Until next time, keep questioning the silence.